Hi, I'm Paul Ruud, a professor in the Department of Economics at Vassar College. And I'm going to talk to you about John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher from the 19th century. He was a remarkable man, and I want to talk to you in particular about his connection to economics, the so-called dismal science. He described his work as merely tidying up the preceding research by Adam Smith and David Ricardo, but he did much, much more. He actually provided a bridge to the subsequent work of Francis Edgeworth and Alfred Marshall. Before I get into the details of the economics, let me just sketch for you some of the important features of his life. He was a precocious child. His father had him engaged in rigorous learning from very, very young. Apparently, he was already reading Greek at the age of 3. He completed his education by the age of 15. There was nothing more for his father to teach him. And he spent the next 4 years editing a 5-volume work of Jeremy Bentham's collected pieces. But by the age of 20, he suffered from enormous sadness and even contemplated suicide. He recovered from this depression, apparently by reading the poetry of Wordsworth. In Wordsworth, he found someone who appreciated the inner life, who extolled solitude, and who drew attention to the beauty of nature. These things gave him a joy that he had not experienced before that time, that then centered him and became a life force for him and an inspiration in all his subsequent work. 5 years later, he met his life partner, Harriet Taylor. Now, people have spent a lot of time talking about their relationship, and I'll let you look up the details of that. I want to focus on their intellectual cooperation. He credited her with making contributions to some of his most famous works, such as On Liberty and The Principles of Political Economy. So what was so dismal about economics? The classical economists had constructed, through a certain combination of ideas, a very dismal view of where the world was going. Adam Smith had promulgated the wages fund doctrine. Thomas Malthus had constructed a model of population, and David Ricardo combined these two things in a prediction of a falling rate of profit and a long-run stationary equilibrium in which labor would be living at a subsistence wage and landowners would be collecting all the rents. Adam Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, analyzed wages as depending on a wage fund. And his theory became known as the wage fund doctrine. Classical economics rested on this view of how wages were determined. The wage fund was fixed because it was the savings of capitalists that enabled production to take place. By saving, they had resources to support workers during production before the product was able to go to market and earn an income for the capitalist. So this wage fund was fixed, and the only thing that varied was the number of workers, which essentially was the population. So the wage was the wage fund divided by the population. The second component of this classical view was Malthus' population thesis. Malthus posited that population would always grow faster than the food supply. If the food supply increased, then population would increase to take advantage of it. And as a result, the average amount of food that was available for anyone would always fall to the point where population could no longer increase. Malthus' population hypothesis was used by classical economists to argue against humanitarian aid for the poor. The basic issue was that if you helped them, then you were effectively increasing the food supply. That would increase their population and drive down again the amount of food that was available for any individual. So poverty was inevitable. The poor were always going to be with us. And humanitarian aid was misguided. The third component of this classical edifice was created by David Ricardo. And he argued that a consequence of Malthus' population thesis and the wage fund doctrine was that the rate of profit had to fall in the long run. David Ricardo's argument went something like this. In the early phases of an economy, the capitalists would be able to save and there would be lots of growth, including population growth. But that population growth would put strains on the food supply. And as a result, farming would have to become more intensive, or less fertile kinds of land would have to be brought into service. In both cases, the food supply would not be able to keep up with the population. The population would continue to drive the wage down. It would make the value of fertile agricultural land greater and increase rents to the landlord at the cost of profits to the capitalist businessman. And in the long run, profits would be driven to zero, rents would be the only gains that would be made, and everyone would live at a subsistence wage, except, of course, the landlords. Now let me turn to John Stuart Mill's response to this. Mill argued that two forces, not one, determined the distribution of income. Classical economists relied exclusively on competition. In fact, for classical economists, competition was the best way to determine the distribution of income. Mill pointed out that institutions or custom also played a key role in how resources were shared among people. In making his argument, Mill pointed out that the competitive market had not always been the key means of sharing resources. There are economies, he said, let me quote, where there are no enterprising competitors. Those who have capital prefer to leave it where it is, to make less profit by it in a more quiet way. Mill also argued for a different stationary state. Even though all classical economists at the time were confronted with evidence that the falling rate of profit wasn't happening, and they all chose to ignore it, he maintained the wage fund doctrine of Smith and the Malthusian population thesis. But he saw the possibility for a different outcome. Mill questioned whether a nation that was growing, such as England at the time, was always a wonderful place to be. Mill found reprehensible many aspects of a prosperous, growing economy. In particular, let me quote him here, he argued against the trampling, crushing, elbowing, and treading on each other's heels. Individual development, personal growth, these were some of the things that Mill thought ought to be incorporated in a healthy society and economy. Not all things good were material, as the utilitarians like Bentham and his father James Mill had argued. According to Mill, a better state could be determined by focusing on the economic and the non-economic aspects of well-being. It is only in the backward countries of the world that increased production is still an important object. In those most advanced, what is economically needed is better distribution. So Mill wanted to see a slower growing economy, one that eased into a situation where there was a redistribution of resources and there wasn't a need or a desire to compete and put oneself ahead of others. In fact, other things were more important. In Mill's stationary state, a kinder and less materialistic life is lived. Quoting Mill again, he sought to ensure a world in which, while no one is poor, no one desires to be richer, nor has any reason to fear being thrust back by the efforts of others to push themselves forward. So we see that Mill was also quite advanced in his thinking about the environment, because he was promoting the environment as a good in and of itself. Quoting Mill one last time in a description of what he foresaw. I cannot, therefore, regard the stationary states of capital and wealth with the unaffected aversion so generally manifested towards it by political economists of the old school. If the earth must lose the great portion of its pleasantness, which it owes to things that the unlimited increase of wealth and population would extirpate from it, for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger, but not a better or a happier population, I sincerely hope, for the sake of posterity, that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compelled them to it. So Mill, in fact, promoted a much happier view of the long term that economics could help produce than the classical economists who preceded him. So it's not that connects Mill to the phrase the dismal science. It's his association and actually a long-term friendship with Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish historian, philosopher, and mathematician. Carlyle was famous for his historical claim that the history of the world is the biography of great men. Carlyle was a gifted essayist, and he also was the one who coined the phrase, the dismal science. He made this attribution in a racist essay about re-enslaving the blacks of the West Indies. Not a gay science, I should say, like some we have heard of. No, a dreary, desolate, and indeed quite abject and distressing one. What we might call, by way of eminence, the dismal science. It was dismal in finding the secret of this universe in supply and demand, and reducing the duty of human governors to that of letting men alone. Instead, Carlyle argued that the natives of the West Indies should be enslaved to do productive work. In particular, he wanted to see them producing spices that were highly desirable in his country. A fuller picture of Carlyle's ideas about work appeared a short time after his racist essay. To each of you I will then say, here is work for you. Strike into it with manlike, soldier-like obedience and heartiness, according to the methods here prescribed. Wages follow for you without difficulty. All manner of just remuneration, and at length emancipation itself follows. Refuse to strike into it, shirk the heavy labor, disobey the rules, I will admonish and endeavor to incite you. If in vain, I will flog you. If still in vain, I will at last shoot you, and make God's earth and the forlorn hope in God's battle free of you. As his longtime friend, Mill's views about this could have been no secret to Carlyle. And in the very next issue of the journal that published his racist essay, Mill's response appeared. Among the things that Mill said, he noted that Carlyle valued work for its own sake and argued against this. Carlyle incessantly prays heaven that all persons, black and white, may be put in possession of this divine right of being compelled, if permitted, will not serve to do what work they are appointed for. But as this cannot be conveniently managed just yet, he will begin with the blacks and will make them work for certain whites, those whites not working at all, that so the eternal purpose and supreme will may be fulfilled, and injustice, which is forever accursed, may cease. Mill broke with Carlyle and later acknowledged in his autobiography that he had made a mistake, that he had misjudged the man's character early on in their relationship. And so we see that the dismal science was so labeled because of economists' objection to slavery and arguing for the emancipation of blacks. I'd like to conclude by referring you to some other sources. I highly recommend a book by Landreth and Collender on the history of economic thought. Much of what I have said today has drawn from their work. I also encourage you to look at a couple of essays in The New Yorker. The first was by Rachel Cohen, Can You Forgive Him? And it's about the relationship between Carlyle and John Stuart Mill. And the second essay in The New Yorker is by Adam Gopnik, called Right Again. It's about how Mill was so far ahead of his time and always right. And finally, you might look at David Levy's piece, How the Dismal Science Got Its Name. I've obviously relied upon him as well. Do look up some of John Stuart Mill's work online. It's easy to find and it's fun to read.